All right, thank you. It's really honor to be here and to see such a great turnout for this talk, for this whole audio, for this whole meeting. So I'm going to start by restricting the scope of what I talk about because I've realized I'm saying too many things and I'm not talking about enough things. So it's been hard to try to balance. So I'm going to focus on how can adaptations be reconciled with the interests of study participants? That's the main ethical issue. What values then should govern the decisions about whether to adapt or not? That's the second strand. And we've already seen then when we talk about adapting, there's initiating and adding arms, there's stopping and dropping arms, and there's changing randomization weights and lots of other things. And so from the statistical point of view, those are very different and they're governed by different things. And I want to try to say from the ethical standpoint, many of these things are very similar and should be governed by the similar types of considerations. So part of the idea in the background, so I'm going to zoom out here and say, there's a duty that we have. If we leave the science, our patients with the science of today, patients tomorrow with the science of today, we will have failed them. Because there's so many patients whose diseases are untreated, whose needs are unmet. And so there's a duty to learn. And trials are an important part of that, but that means the trials are instrumental. They're a thing that we do not out of curiosity, but out of the need to generate the information that we need to make health systems work for patients. So that's part of social value. And then we have to organize science and clinical research on terms that respect the participants as free and equal. So we have to get their free and informed consent. We have to show concern for their well-being. We have to show them equal regard. We can't treat them as less than we treat people outside of studies. They don't lose their status as citizens with full human rights and so on. So in the book, I talk about many of these values. I'm only going to talk about social value and concern for well-being here. So if you expected to talk on informed consent, I'm not going to talk about informed consent. I'm just presupposing we would never enroll somebody in a trial without getting their informed consent with some exceptions for emergency research and so on. I also am restricting the scope in the sense that we will talk about adaptations across the whole spectrum of research. And so, you can crudely divide research into early exploratory work where what you're trying to do is figure out whether a drug, for instance, can be part of the ensemble of knowledge, practices, procedures that would one day unlock some sort of clinical value from that, therapeutic value, prophylactic value. And so the justification for the early exploratory work is, can we assemble such an intervention that may one day have social value? I'm not really going to talk about that because it's governed by a different set of concerns, or at least that I know Rika will talk about this later. So I'm looking mostly at the confirmatory stage where we think we have the drug, the set of practices, procedures, the knowledge that we need in order to unlock its clinical value, and we're going to test to see whether that's the case. So by social value here, I just mean studies need to close important knowledge gaps. They need to try to make health systems more effective. So we need drugs that do better or work when nothing works. We want it to be more equitable, so not everybody's health needs are met. So we need interventions for people who don't have, who currently needs aren't met as well as other patients. But efficiency is also something, it's a shared pie, and we want to make our health systems do better with fewer resources so that we can treat more of the health needs that are in those systems. When I talk about concern for well-being now, the idea here is it's impermissible to knowingly provide a person with an intervention that is known or credibly believed. I don't want to, if there are other philosophers in the audience who would be like known or credibly believed to be worse than an available alternative. So part of what I want to say here is randomization is permissible when there is uncertainty or conflict about the relative merits of a set of interventions. So usually I'll just talk about two for simplicity, but my set could have many, many members. So when I say here uncertainty or conflict, now we get into a lot of literature in ethics about which I've a participant and written a lot. So here's my biased opinion, but I'm trying to persuade you over to my side that individual uncertainty is too restrictive, and so it isn't the thing that we should care about. And so this is, for those of you who've read the literature, there's equipoise, there's clinical equipoise, there's theoretical equipoise, there's a lot, a proliferation of nomenclature. For me, the question now is just under what conditions is it permissible to randomize? So I want you to entertain the following situation. If you've got some experts who prefer intervention A to B for a specific set of patients who have clinical characteristics that we can define and so on. Other experts, though, prefer B to A for those same patients. Then this would be a case where there's no individual clinician who is uncertain in the sense of like, I don't know. And there's no individual clinician who's indifferent, right? In the sense of like, I think they're of equal value or something like that. Everybody has a strict opinion and they favor one intervention over another. If you thought individual uncertainty was necessary to randomize patients, then in this situation, you wouldn't be able to randomize anybody, which is like Pareto suboptimal. Means it's the worst situation because we don't learn, so everybody is worse off, and no patient is made better off by not running that trial. Okay, moreover, patients have rights and they can choose their provider. And so if the providers are properly credentialed and informed providers and one would recommend A for you, and so I could choose that provider and be given A with certainty, or I could choose the other provider and be given B with certainty, then why it would be impermissible for me to flip a coin or roll a die and use any method to determine whether I'm allocated to clinician A or clinician B as long as the probabilities sum to 1. So this is a foundation for the remarks that I want to make. If I've persuaded you about this, then this is the secret sauce to the rest of the talk. So if we restrict patients, if we say you can't be randomized in a trial that meets these conditions, that would be either unjustified paternalism, overreach on the part of the medical profession because now they want to stop a person from exercising a right that they have, and it would be socially deleterious. It would be undermining the values I started out with here, social value, trying to make health systems more effective, more efficient, and so on. So I think this is a powerful argument. So now let's talk about, okay, so what are the conditions under which it's okay to initiate a study? Because I think this is going to be the same conditions now for adding an arm to an ongoing study. So here, I apologize now to statisticians in the audience, but I'm setting this up just to use the cartoon. Okay, so all models are wrong, but they can be useful. So I'm just trying to make, so imagine here in this setup that if you favor intervention A, you're on the left side. If you favor intervention B, you're on the right side. But now what I'm measuring here is what I'm plotting are for each expert, what's their view? And so the idea is here's an expert who mildly favors intervention A. So we'd plot them over here. Here's an expert who mildly favors intervention B. So we would plot them over here. And we can stack them up as we go out and we survey like, hey, how many experts are there in each of these camps, right? And maybe, we get some nice Gaussian, distribution of experts. And so, then we could sort of be like, so our little histogram type curve, is representing the density of experts, right, with this set of beliefs. And so in work that I've done with Jonathan Kimmelman, who's here and who will speak later, and Patrick Kane, we looked at, well, what are the shapes that these distribution of expert opinion could take in the community? And I'm not going to talk about all of that here. I'm going to talk about just this one, which is, this is what it should look like for the optimal initiation of a study. That is, the majority of the clinical population, the expert clinician population, favor the standard of care. But the new intervention has managed to recruit a minority of experts who are like, I think this might actually be a good intervention. So when we think about now initiating a trial and a traditional sort of fixed sample study, we've got blocks of patients and we've got our interventions. And so, we've got some prior distribution, but now not prior distribution about, like you heard earlier, not about the belief about the efficacy of the intervention. You have a prior distribution of opinion in the expert community, belief in the expert community. And what we want the study to do, right? We want to randomize allocate our blocks of patients, everybody in this case, to the relevant interventions, and then look at the outcome with the goal that, well, so I've got my positive negative. So if B turned out to be superior, right, the standard of care was what works. This is what you probably see in the majority of trials that you run. Then the idea should be we should stop that migration to the new intervention. People are like, this new thing looks really good. Well, I'm running this trial to stop that, because if it doesn't work, we don't want people to continue to provide it, right? That would work against the idea of efficiency in our health system. So this is this part about social value, that we want our studies to generate evidence that's sufficiently reliable. Now this is the collaboration between the ethicists and the statisticians and the regulators, sufficiently reliable so that our estimate of the clinical merits of these interventions will shift the practice. So if we show that the new intervention doesn't work, people stop using it. If we show that the new intervention does work, more people use it and move away from the standard of care, recognizing that there can be differences in patients and populations and stuff like that. So concern for well-being then says, yeah, I can randomize a patient. It's permissible as long as this reasonable minority, if a reasonable minority says, I would recommend A for you, then I can randomize you to A. If a reasonable minority says, I'd recommend B from you, then I can randomize you to A or B, and so on. But if nobody says, like, for C, if there's nobody who says I would allocate that to you, then I can't randomize you to it. That would be the idea. So this is just this notion then that we want to start out with something looks promising and then run the trial at the point where, right, if we don't run the trial, then you get this confusing experience from confounded data in the world where people are like, this thing really works. And so more and more people start to recruit to it. You run a well-designed trial early, and then the idea is you should shift the population of practice either to the thing that works or away from the thing that doesn't work. Okay, so what about early stopping? So we've already seen the presentation about early stopping. And so the idea here is I'm randomizing and I'm not allocating my full population. I'm allocating a portion of my population of patients, right? And then the idea should be, so from the statistician side, what we've seen is, well, there are these trade-offs now between bias and variance, and the idea is we need to control those trade-offs so that if we stop early, we actually get this shift, right? And so the point there is this is the collaboration. We have to go to our statistician colleagues and say, can we control bias to the point that when this trial is over, right, if it shows that the new intervention doesn't work, that people are going to give it up. Conversely, if we show that it does work, we'd say, well, it's likely that our early stopping showed an effect that's larger than the true effect, but that's okay because the bias is probably not so large that it's a false positive, right? That this thing doesn't actually work. So that, from the ethics standpoint, is the criterion, right? That you tell me that there's going to be these trade-offs between bias, variance, these other things. Can we control that to the point where I should still believe the result? Right? And maybe there isn't an early stopping, and so we continue. Okay, I said that. So now what about adding arms? So what I want to say is adding arms is just the same idea. If we have a trial that's ongoing, but new evidence has accrued about some new intervention, then the idea is, well, now is there a group of experts whose opinion would be recruited to the idea that this new intervention, gamma, right, is sufficiently compelling that I think it should be tried, right? I think I've got an ensemble of drug knowledge practices that's going to provide a benefit to patients. Well, let's add that into our trial and see. So there's other types of adaptation. Oops. Sorry. And so I'm only going to talk here now about response adaptation. because the idea is early stopping is a kind of adaptation. Changing the sample size is a kind of adaptation. Response adaptation ethically looks a bit different because there are people who want to say something like, isn't the opinion of the trial changing so that it shows us that the intervention that is being downweighted isn't any good? And so how can I continue to randomize people to the intervention that's being downweighted if the trial as an agent almost, right? So this is the view that like the trial is an agent, and if the trial is not favoring the intervention that's being downweighted, how can I continue to randomize people to that? So this gets away from the questions of social value, which should govern the initiation of the trial and the decision to its design, to this question of concern for well-being. Is it ethical to have a participant in a trial like this? So here, what I want to say is that response adaptive randomization should not be designed to imitate the decisions of a single Bayesian agent. So we shouldn't look at this trial like the trial is a single Bayesian agent. There are a bunch of reasons. The three I'll say here are that I don't think that we should regard the weights as the beliefs of any agent. If we do regard the trial as a Bayesian agent, then why isn't it just one agent among many? Because in the idea was there were a bunch of different experts, and if we construct our consensus expert through some sort of pooling, then why haven't we just multiplied agents and we've got one more agent among the rest, and why should this agent be special? And then the third point, and I have a reserve slide if it comes up, that if we construct this Bayes agent by pooling, it won't look like any of the underlying agents that it's constructed from. So we'll wind up in a situation where no expert would think whether I should give this drug to this person should depend on like what the temperature is in Beijing today. But the consensus expert will, because the conditional probabilities aren't maintained depending on the linear pooling algorithm that you use. And so this is just a way to say, you don't want to have a trial where the beliefs of the trial don't reflect the beliefs of any underlying agent. And that's what can happen depending on how you would construct the Bayesian agent. So instead, what I want to say is something like, we should think about the diversity of experts in the community and try to model that diversity. So what would that mean? So I love this because statisticians love urns, and I was able to, this is the urn in my talk. So I'm a big urn fan. There are wheel fans, there are coin fans, and spinning wheel fans, but I'm an urn fan. So what I've tried to do is put my distribution of the expert community inside the urn, where the idea is, imagine what we do is we reach into the urn and what we pick out is an expert. And then we say, what do you think that we should do for this patient? And that expert is an A favoring expert. So we would give the patient intervention A, and then we would see what the effects are. And then we put everybody then updates their belief, right? So it may be that because we saw that A worked, and because there was somebody that was, right, I'm not good, I wish, if there was animations, oops, right, I moved the wrong guy, but, there should be somebody who's like right on the margin, who's kind of like, right, so there should be somebody right on the margin who's like, yep, I'm recruited over, I saw that positive result, I was a little bit on the margin, and so this is the idea of shifting weights now, where what the weight represents is something like the proportion of experts in the relevant, community who favor A or favor B. And then as you continue to run the trial, what does that mean? You're just reaching into the urn and you're pulling out another expert, and then you're acting according to that expert's judgment after you update on the basis of the evidence that you see. And so now what the weights reflect is something like, how large is the population of clinicians in your model who favor A or favor B? How am I doing on time? Okay. And so it would still be the case, though, that even though the population that favors A or favors B in this case is shrinking, we would say, yes, but we can randomize you to B because there are still experts in the community who would favor B for you. If we stopped the trial, there would still be people who are like, yeah, continue to use B. And if the point of the trial is to shift the behavior of the community, then what you want the trial to be is an idealized set of experts who update their opinions on evidence. And so then they would be like, yeah, if I'm persuaded, right? And so if you have diversity, you have some people who are very indifferent, you have stronger, people who are like, no, I really think this thing works. Then you may need to see more evidence before you persuade everybody. And there's a question, exactly when should we quit and when is somebody a credible expert versus a crank and so on. But those are questions that aren't specific to this approach. Those are questions we have to deal with all the time anyway. So I think the decision to use adaptive randomization and other types of adaptation should be grounded in the question of social value. Does altering the randomization weights or updating in some way produce some benefit? Does it help us generate the same evidence with fewer patients or with fewer harms to participants? Or does it allow us to generate a broader bandwidth of information with the same patients or so on? And that should be made explicit. We want to say exactly what's the benefit that we get here at that level. And if there is a benefit, then we need to show how the randomization respects it shows concern for welfare, respects the interests of study participants. Okay, so and so that's why I'm just emphasizing here, right, that if it's permissible for one practitioner to provide this person with an intervention with certainty in practice, and if it's permissible for another clinician to provide this person with a different intervention in practice, then any allocation of the weights. And so in that sense now, when the statisticians are like, I need to do a block, not, we need to update, we don't want a greedy algorithm is too greedy, I need to have a block of patients and then update. Well, that's fine. We can still incorporate those views into how we adjust the weights because we want to have the social value condition. And respect for well-being is pretty broad, right? Until we eliminate a group of experts that wouldn't recommend the intervention, or sorry, until there's no group of experts that would recommend the intervention, then we continue to randomize. And so that's really all I had to say. And I think I'm out of time. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Alex. Just as a message to people who are online, if you're interested in asking a question, just stick your hand up and I think Alison will let us know. So questions? 1, 2.
Thank you. I may have a very basic question because I might have missed a sentence at the beginning that's important for my understanding here. When we talk about intervention A and B and assigning weights in this framework, where's the placebo standard of care randomization group in that framework?
Oh, so yeah, so the idea would be one of those is the standard of care, right? Let's
so we choose not to be treated
on the. Yeah, I mean B is the standard of care. But it's treated as just one of these interventions in the set.
If that includes a placebo as well?
It just depends now. Yeah. If there's no known effective intervention and we can give you the placebo on top of whatever the supportive care that we give you, sure.
Okay, thank you.
Who's behind you?
Thank you very much. I think I agree with a lot of modeling there, but you have some assumptions like you need experts, so you need to define who is an expert that counts. You assume that experts can update their beliefs, right? And you have defined, you said you need a minority. So how much is a minority? Is one expert enough? So I can imagine if there is a new treatment, a clinician came up with an idea, one person believes this works, is this enough to start a clinical trial? And by the end of the trial, if you don't convince everyone who is on standard of care, what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, all of those are issues that are not specific to me and anything that I've said. I mean, anytime you initiate a study, the question is, why are you initiating this study? Is it because some crank somewhere thinks that it's going to work? Should you ever run a trial? Look, there have been interventions that have taken off. Most credible experts are like, I wouldn't do that, but patients want it. So should you ever then be like, let's run a trial to see if that doesn't work? The questions that you're raising, they're at a more fundamental level, right? I mean, we could model. So one of the things that you could do here is your experts and colleagues, at my university have done this, where it's like, yeah, I'm going to just model experts. So my experts are just going to be models that are representative of people in society, and they update as a Bayesian agent would. And I think that's very attractive. The only question is, what's the external validity? Like at the end of the day, these exercises are very practical exercises to change the opinions of real people. If they'll never update their opinion, then what are we doing here? Number one. And so we've got to have a compromise between the ideal frictionless plane and the actual people in the world. Now, I also believe that, as I think you probably do too, that there will be people for almost any intervention who are so committed they'll die before they change their mind. And that's why usually in a lot of these trials, as I'm sure you know, like you don't say we need to get to 0. You say something like, if we're at 5% or 10% or something like that, with the idea that there's always going to be a residual of people who just won't ever change their beliefs. I think that's fine. And I think then the question is something like, how do I know at the initiation of the trial that I'm not sampling from that residual 10% or something like that? If finding a solution to that problem would help this and any trial.
I had a kind of very similar question posed in a slightly different way, which is, if I squint, I can just about map on the decision process for initiating trials onto this kind of model, and I can't really map on the design process of the trials. Like we don't. Well, I kind of could, but what are your thoughts on how we should change how we make decisions about whether a trial happens, which is a complex thing involving ethics, funders,
yep,
clinicians, and what the trial looks like in terms of, is it set up to provide convincing evidence that will actually change clinical practice?
Right. So I think there needs to be more. So first of all, I'm not a statistician, so I'm out of my depth here. I'll just say I'd like to see more about the relationship between the quality of the evidence that we generate and how persuasive that's going to be in the community, which would differ depending on like how many people are affected by this intervention. If it's a very rare disease, right, versus it's very prevalent and widespread, because I do think there needs to be some relationship between the characteristics of the trial and then the population opinion. And I take it that that's sort of like maybe now to plump for the divide here, Bayesians want to say something like, well, that's my advantage, because what I want to try to do is model the beliefs of the different distributions of beliefs in the community. Frequentists, I don't know what they say other than something like, well, you ought to believe what I'm saying if it's a p-value of such and such, right? But as a finger shaker, that often doesn't work. So yeah, because you don't want to run the studies and wind up in a position then where it's like, well, we did all that patient effort, money, everything else, but we haven't moved community opinion.
Last one.
Thanks for the talk. I had similar questions to Peter when you presented this slide. And one I was also wondering about is, if a company develops a new drug candidate, how are they going to share the information with a pool of experts that they can even make this decision? Isn't not really just one or two scientists in a company saying this is potentially something good, and then they talk to the regulatory agencies, or is it really shared amongst a pool of experts? I don't know. I know.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. This model is the easiest to understand in situations where what you're doing is you're looking at things that are already available, where for a disease where there is diversity of treatment for patients of the same type, that then you'd be like, well, now, which wouldn't have this shape, right? So it would be more like, this bimodal distribution where you have different people that favor different things. Then at least you can kind of be like, oh, well, now I can quantify, like, I know the people at UCLA do sepsis this way, but the people at Pitt do sepsis this way. So, which one actually works, right? And then I think there's this really good question, though, like, what is the bar to initiating studies? Especially this came up last night at dinner. So Jonathan was like, if you lower the bar to initiating studies too much, are you just going to get junk that goes in? And so in that sense, I think there's something real here about, like, what is the bar for the credible, saying like this hypothesis is really credible, like this is ready to go into people. And so, yes, the experts here are just proxy. They're just they're like thermometers. They're epistemic pointers. It's something like, has my evidence reached the point where people are like, yes, we should greenlight that. And I think it's an ethical question about, well, what should that standard of evidence be, and how can we operationalize it? I agree. Like, just asking, are there experts who think isn't great, but it's like democracy. It seems like it's the best of all the options that we have.
If you